This is a quick update, not on my desktop, but instead on my iPad. You see, I sold my iPad Pro and bought a cheap and kind of terrible Windows tablet. And, to my great surprise, it's been kind of a pleasure. So I wanted to talk about it. First, a little backstory. I got the iPad Pro not when it launched in 2018 in the new design, but instead when iPadOS was launched, thinking in hindsight a little naively that this meant a new focus and a new approach towards thinking about computers. I realize now iPadOS was split off from iOS not to give iPadOS special attention, but probably just to let them focus more of their attention on iOS, where the bulk of their sales come from. I'd been looking for a replacement for the iPad for a while, had struggled a bit with the ideal solution. After a bit of searching, however, I settled on the HP 11-inch tablet, model name 11N-BE0013DX. While its price is notionally $499, it is almost always on sale at Best Buy for $199. To put it in context, that's a quarter of the price of the iPad Pro. And while you may not think it, it solves just about every issue I've had with the fancy iPad Pro I used to have. Just to give some context, this has an Intel Pentium Silver N6000, which is a passively cooled x86 CPU. It has 4GB of RAM and comes with Windows 11 in S mode. On paper, this looks exactly as terrible as that $199 price tag suggests. But in a surprising number of ways, it matches the experience of using an A12X on the iPad Pro, and far surpasses it in quite a few ways as well. I was a little worried about the 4GB of RAM, the same as my old iPad Pro, but in practice, this isn't really much of a concern. I saw a few suggestions online. The HP Tablet 11 was slow even for basic tasks. I saw this in both customer testimonials and in the 1 or 2 professional reviews that are available, and this had me a little worried. Well, I shouldn't have been. Frankly, it's totally fine for basic tasks like browsing. If I were to compare it to the iPad, I would say it is perhaps a beat slower, but not so much as to be aggravating, or even particularly noticeable. And in terms of keeping things in the background from reloading, the HP far surpasses the iPad, without being bogged down by background tasks either. I'm the kind of person who likes to keep multiple tabs open, and there's no real slowdown on Windows versus the same 4GB of RAM on the iPad. There's frankly quite a bit of laudatory language as it pertains to memory optimization on iOS, but a lot of that seems to just be their ruthless closing of background activities, including browser tabs. It was a very frustrating aspect of using the iPad. So, are there any downsides to the HP tablet? Well, there are 2. For one, the screen is too bright at the minimum brightness for my liking. I like that it's 100% flicker-free, and it's a comfortable aspect ratio at 3:2. But I'm the kind of person who likes to dim the screen a lot, and even at its lowest setting, the screen is a little bright. For a normal user, this is likely not at all a concern. The bigger issue is the battery life, which is fairly objectively poor. I would say I get around 4 hours or so charging the battery as I normally would. I like to stop charging my devices at around 70% to preserve battery health. That's just not practical on the HP. So I find myself charging it to around 85 to 90%, which will likely degrade the battery over time. Furthermore, compared with the iPad, the speakers are definitely poor. I could listen to music on the iPad, and while it wasn't overwhelmingly excellent, it was at least passable. Here on the HP, I wouldn't recommend it. But for system sounds and podcasts and the like, the HP is of course perfectly passable. The lack of a high refresh rate is also not as big a concern as you might think. If you're doing a lot of drawing, the 120Hz refresh rate of the iPad Pro will likely be sorely missed. But in daily use, the lack of a high refresh rate is not at all an issue. I primarily use the device with a mouse and keyboard, so this probably tints my view as well. Still, I can scroll through long documents fairly comfortably, and there's only a slight bit of jitter as I scroll using the touchscreen. As for any concern that the device is too slow for a full Windows machine, remember that you can optimize the OS within the settings. I turn off a lot of the visual enhancements that I find extraneous, and by using a third-party utility, you can remove a lot of the grimy aspects of Windows. There wasn't much bloat, but I removed a few HP programs as well. After these simple steps, There really isn't much difference between this HP tablet and the 10600K on my desktop, at least for normal use. Again, this is the power of a full desktop OS. You can tailor it to your liking. As for the next steps, I also want to try using a cheap third-party stylus on the HP, something which I did not attempt with the iPad because of the many proprietary features exclusive to the Apple Pencil. I can also use my, now sadly soon-to-be defunct, Stadia controller as a wired USB controller, something which also could not be done on the iPad because it lacked the drivers. Likewise, scrolling using a third-party mouse on the iPad was quite janky owing to a proprietary API that they use. No such issues on Windows. There's a micro SD card slot as well, for cheap and obviously slightly slow secondary storage. And unlike on the iPad, I can format drives and not have to worry about file corruption while copying large amounts of data, a huge issue on the iPad. Obviously, being that this is Windows, there are a ton of programs, some of them dating back to the dawn of the computer, no doubt. But a lot of modern apps are undoubtedly better on mobile devices, and on the iOS App Store in particular. But here as well, Windows is fairly flexible, allowing for websites to be used as progressive web apps on Edge. My primary browser is Firefox, of course. So I still maintain access to things like Google Play Books and Libby and the like. Still, a word of caution here. You can't use the Android subsystem for Windows on this device, as far as I'm aware. There's likely a workaround, but I'm not sufficiently interested to search for it. Still, if you're looking at this and thinking you can run Android apps, it is perhaps best to reconsider. I don't want to give off the impression that the iPad is a bad device. Far from it. It's incredibly satisfying to use in its own right, and for a certain kind of user, it is an invaluable tool. But for many other kinds of users, the frustrations are surprisingly many, and I'm here to tell you that there is a viable alternative in the cheap Windows tablet. Random iPad things, like picture-in-picture, are easily handled by browsers like Firefox, which has a similar function. Windows is also very good at Windows, and you can split the screen in various permutations, all of which it handles natively. And that's to say nothing of external monitor support, something which my 2018 vintage iPad Pro wouldn't be able to support, even on iPadOS 16. On this HP tablet, it works just as any Windows laptop would. Again, there's real benefit to having a full desktop OS even on a tablet. Likewise, as it pertains to device longevity, Apple is definitely commendable with how it approaches device support. But that's only really in relation to Android. In practice, they frequently drop off old models, and a lot of features are exclusive to the newer designs. You can see this with the new hover feature on the Apple Pencil, which are, apparently, exclusive to the M2 iPad Pro. They make these fairly arbitrary decisions sometimes, even though on paper they support their devices for a long time. By comparison, this is a Windows device, so it gets updated for near eternity, and it supports software from the dark ages by comparison. A lot of other long-running iPadOS frustrations, like the inability to have granular control over audio sources and levels, and to have multiple instances of sound concurrently, are also not a concern on Windows. One major problem I have encountered, however, is with the Wi-Fi performance. It seems to have trouble maintaining a connection, and I can only really use the 2.4 GHz band reliably, which is unfortunate as it nominally supports Wi-Fi 6. And I use a Bluetooth mouse and keyboard, which shares the same 2.4 GHz frequency. Not ideal. To be sure, it's nowhere near as fluid to use as a tablet than an iPad. The scrolling animations are less smooth, and gestures are inconsistent across programs, for obvious reasons. The on-screen keyboard is actually better on Windows, in my view, than on iOS, and you'd frankly be surprised, given the opposite direction it comes from, to the iPad, how closely it lands as a tablet. I'm not suggesting that everyone should go and sell their fancy iPad Pro and replace it with a cheap Windows tablet, but for a lot of users, they'd frankly be surprised by how much of the iPad experience can be retained while getting rid of the major iPadOS frustrations. Thanks for listening.